There are places in Mexico that don't appear on tourist maps. Personal fiefdoms, kingdoms of dust and silence, ruled by men whose power is older than the law, more absolute than the government, a power that is inherited, that runs through the blood. Sometimes in a way that is all too literal. Today we are going to Colima, to the shadow of the volcano, to a fertile green valley owned by a single family, the Montemayor's. For almost a century, Don Eladio Montemayor was more than a landowner. He was a king, a god. His word was law. His will was destiny. And his greatest obsession was his lineage, the purity of his blood, the perpetuation of his power. To ensure that power never left the family, Don Eladio broke the last taboo. He created a monstrous system, a twisted tradition that turned his daughters into vessels, and his granddaughters into candidates. Candidates for a crown of thorns, for a life of silent horror. This is the story of a family secret that poisoned a land, of a power that devoured itself, and of a young doctor who tried to stop the nightmare, only to crash into a wall taller than the mountains. The wall of indifference, the wall of the system, if you believe that darkness thrives in silence, if you believe that we must name horror, even if it burns our mouths, stay with me, subscribe, and listen. Because there are kingdoms that must fall. Javier Herrera arrived in San Isidro del Fuego like all medical interns do, with a suitcase full of books and a head full of idealism. It was his year of social service, a formality, a requirement for graduation. The town was small, isolated, hanging on the slopes of the volcano. The people were friendly but reserved. Their smiles didn't reach their eyes. And in their eyes, Javier saw something he hadn't studied in college. Fear, an old, deep-rooted fear, like the roots of ancient trees. At first, he ignored it. He focused on his work, in the small clinic with its peeling walls and chronic shortage of medicine. He treated colds. He stitched machete wounds. He delivered babies. But soon, he began to notice a pattern. Something didn't add up. A strangely high incidence of certain problems. Children born with cleft palates, with fused fingers, with abnormally fragile bones. It wasn't an epidemic. These were isolated cases, scattered over the years. But they all had something in common. An invisible thread connected them. All of them, in one way or another, were related to the family that lived on the ranch. The Las Animas Ranch, the Montemayor family home. Javier began to ask questions, carefully. He asked the village nurse, an elderly woman named Ofelia. Ofelia, do you have the Montemayor family's medical records? The woman turned pale. She dropped a bottle of alcohol. The sharp smell filled the small room. Doctor, she whispered, picking up the glass with trembling hands. We don't talk about that family. We don't ask questions. They have their own doctors in Guadalajara, in the United States. But the children who are born here, Javier insisted. Ofelia looked at him, and in her eyes, Javier saw fear in its purest form. Some branches of the tree grow crooked, she said, in a voice so low it was barely audible. It is God's will, and Don Eladio's. And she never spoke of the subject again. Javier felt a chill. The name Don Eladio was pronounced with an almost religious reverence. He owned everything: the land, the lemon crops, the water, and apparently, he also owned the people's silence. Javier began to investigate on his own. In the civil registry birth records, in the parish archives, he built a family tree. And what he saw made his blood run cold. The same families, marrying among themselves. Generation after generation. Cousins with cousins, uncles with nieces. The circle was closing tighter and tighter. And at the center of it all, like a spider in its web, was the Montemayor bloodline, the lineage of the Cacique. A lineage that was poisoning itself out of ignorance, or by design. The call came on a stormy night. The clinic phone rang, shrill. It was a man's voice, frightened, urgent. "Doctor, you have to come to the ranch. It's Don Eladio." "What's wrong?" Javier asked. "He's dying," said the voice. "And the girl, he chose her. You have to stop him." The call was cut off. Javier stood there with the receiver in his hand. The sound of the dead line, the roar of the storm outside. The girl, he chose her. That phrase stuck in his mind. He didn't think twice. He grabbed his briefcase. He got into his old Jeep, and he drove into the heart of darkness. Musical pause. A slow, ominous drum roll, like a funeral march. The Las Animas hacienda was not a house. It was a fortress. High walls topped with barbed wire. An iron gate that opened with an agonizing creak. Javier drove down a road flanked by giant ceiba trees. Their branches looked like skeletal arms against the sky, lit by flashes of lightning. The main house was a mass of stone and dark wood. Gloomy, silent. A man was waiting for him at the door. The foreman. He had the face of a killer. "This way," he said, without greeting him. Javier followed him down long, dark corridors. The walls were covered with oil portraits. Generations of Montemayors, all with the same look, arrogant, hard, and with the same eyes. Pale blue, almost transparent. The air smelled of old wax, dampness, and disease. They took him to the main room. The scene was something out of a feudal nightmare. Don Eladio Montemayor lay on a huge bed with a canopy. He was a living skeleton. Yellow skin clung to his bones. But his eyes, those blue Montemayor eyes, still burned with a terrible light. Around the bed were his sons, his daughters, men and women with hard faces, dressed in black. And standing to one side were the granddaughters, 5 young women, between 15 and 20 years old, dressed in white, like brides, or like victims for a sacrifice. Javier looked at them, and the horror he had suspected became a physical certainty. One of them had a deformed left hand, her fingers fused together. Another had a visibly misaligned jaw. They all had the same sickly pallor, the same fragility, and they all had the same look, empty, dull, resigned. Don Eladio coughed, a hollow, wet sound. He raised a trembling hand and pointed at the youngest, a girl who couldn't have been more than 15 years old. Her name was Ana. "She," whispered the old man. His voice was a rattle. "She is the strong one, the one with pure blood. She will be the new mother of our lineage." The girl's mother, one of Eladio's daughters, knelt down and kissed the old man's hand. She was crying, but they were not tears of pain. They were tears of gratitude, of fanatical pride. "Thank you, Father," she sobbed. "It is an honor." Javier gasped for breath. He felt the ground move beneath his feet. The metallic taste of shock in his mouth. He understood. They weren't choosing him as the heir to the money. They were choosing her as the next breeding matriarch, the next in line for systematic incest, designed to maintain the purity of blood that was already rotten, to perpetuate power based on madness. The foreman approached Ana. He took her by the arm, roughly. She didn't resist. She was a rag doll. Her blue eyes were fixed on an invisible point on the wall. He led her to a door at the back of the room. "What are you going to do?" asked Javier, his voice trembling with rage. Eladio's eldest son, a man identical to his father but in his 50s, turned to him. "What has always been done, Doctor," he said with terrifying calm. "Consecrate the lineage, prepare the womb. It's our tradition." Javier looked at the door through which Ana had been taken. He understood the second part of the call. You have to stop it. It wasn't just about the choice. It was about what came next. A ritual. A rape. An act to seal the blood pact. With the dying old man, or with the male heir. It didn't matter. It was the same horror. He felt a wave of nausea. He wanted to scream. He wanted to hit someone. But he was alone, surrounded by a family united by madness. He turned and ran. No one stopped him. As he ran through the dark corridors, the muffled scream of a girl followed him. Or maybe it was just the wind, or his own conscience tearing him apart. Musical pause, absolute silence for a few seconds. Then, a dissonant piano note repeats, obsessively. How does it come to this? How does a soul rot to such an extent? Javier spent the night awake, piecing together the puzzle. The Montemayor family was not one of ancient nobility. It was a story of resentment. Don Eladio's grandfather had lost everything in the revolution: land, money, status. They died in poverty, humiliated. Eladio grew up with that poison in his veins. The poison of loss. The hatred of the outside world that had taken away his place. He was a brilliant man, and ruthless. From a young age, he swore to get back what was his, and more. He did it, with hard work, with cunning, and with boundless cruelty. Those who opposed him, he ruined, or he made them disappear. He bought land. He bought people's loyalty. He bought the police, the judge, the mayor. He rebuilt the Montemayor empire. But paranoia consumed him. The same paranoia that had consumed his father. The fear of losing everything again. The outside world was the enemy. Outsiders were impure. Traitors. The Montemayor blood was the only thing sacred. The only thing that could be trusted. He had to protect it. Keep it focused. Pure. He started with his own daughters. He didn't let them marry anyone from outside. He arranged marriages between them and their closest cousins. He promised them paradise in exchange for their obedience. And hell if they refused. Some tried to rebel. A nephew who fell in love with a girl from the village. They found him in a ravine a week later. A horse accident, said the official report. The message was clear. Blood stays in the family. But it wasn't enough. The next generation, his grandchildren, were born with problems. Science screamed that he was wrong. But Eladio didn't believe in science. He believed in his own will. He interpreted the deformities not as a consequence of his actions, but as a test of faith, as an impurity that had to be purged. Only the strongest, those born without visible defects, were worthy. And to further concentrate the strength of the blood, he took the final step. He decided that the next generation would be born from the most direct union possible. Father and daughter, grandfather and granddaughter. He did not see it as a sin. He saw it as a necessary sacrifice, an act of divine eugenics. He became the high priest of his own cult of blood. And his family, trapped in a web of fear and dependence, accepted it as a revealed truth, as the price of their power. With Anna's screams still ringing in his ears, Javier drove like a madman back to the village. He didn't go to the clinic. He went straight to the police station, a small adobe building in the main square. The commander, a fat, sweaty man named Torres, greeted him with a fake smile. Javier, out of breath, his voice broken with rage, told him everything. The dying old man, the girls dressed in white, the election, the ritual. Torres listened patiently, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. When Javier finished, the commander sighed. "Oh, doctor," he said in a patronizing tone that made Javier's stomach churn. "You must be new here." "What do you mean?" "It's a crime. It's rape. Statutory rape." "You saw a family saying goodbye to their patriarch," Torres said with exasperating calm. "You saw ancient customs. Here in the mountains, things are different. Blood calls to blood. Don Eladio has done a lot for this town. We don't get involved in his affairs. He's the chief of police. It's your duty to get involved." Torres's smile disappeared. His eyes hardened. "My duty is to keep the peace, doctor, and you are disturbing the peace. I suggest you forget what you think you saw. Focus on your colds and your births. It's best for everyone." He pointed to the door. The conversation was over. Javier left, feeling like he couldn't breathe. Complicity was a thick blanket suffocating the town. He didn't give up. He drove to Colima, the state capital. He went to the state attorney general's office, a modern building made of glass and steel, a symbol of justice that turned out to be a facade. After hours of waiting, he was received by an agent from the public ministry. A young man in a suit, with the look of someone who has seen it all and no longer cares. Javier told his story again, in more detail, with more desperation. The agent listened, taking no notes, just twirling a pen between his fingers. "Dr. Herrera," he said at the end, "your testimony is alarming. But that's all it is. Your testimony. There is no physical evidence. There is no victim to report it. Without that, we can't request a search warrant to enter private property that, moreover, belongs to Mr. Montemayor. The victim is a 15-year-old girl. She's terrified. Her whole family is involved." The agent stopped twirling the pen. He stared at him. "Look, if you bring the girl here and she testifies, that's another matter. Can you do that?" The question was an insult, a mockery. How am I going to get her out of a ranch that's a fortress guarded by armed men? The agent shrugged. "Then my hands are tied." Hands tied. That phrase again. The epitaph of justice. Javier left the glass building feeling transparent, invisible. The COLIMA'S sun burned his skin. Helplessness was a poison running through his veins. The ticking of the pen, the condescending calm of the police officer. They were small details, small pieces of a huge mechanism designed not to work. Last attempt. The Human Rights Commission. Maybe them. Maybe the humanitarian approach. The office was small, hot. It smelled like old paper. A visitor, Ms. Campos, listened to him with an expression of deep concern. She took notes. She asked questions. For a moment, Javier felt a glimmer of hope. "This is monstrous, doctor. It clearly violates all the rights of these minors," she said. "So, can you do anything?" Javier asked. The lawyer's expression changed. She became professional. Sad. "We can issue a recommendation to the prosecutor's office. We can request precautionary measures. But we are an autonomous body with no coercive powers. We cannot enter by force. We cannot compel anyone to testify. She looked for a brochure. What we can do is give you this number. It's a psychological support line for victims. If you can get any of them to call. Javier looked at the brochure. A phone number. That was his weapon against a feudal king. A phone number. Hope faded. Feeling completely defeated, Javier returned to San Isidro del Fuego. The townspeople looked at him differently. Coldly, suspiciously. Word had spread. The little doctor was causing trouble. One night, he found the tire of his Jeep slashed. The next morning, a cross made of salt was painted on his door. These were warnings. The system wasn't just indifferent, it was actively hostile. It was protecting the monster. One afternoon, the foreman of the ranch visited him at the clinic. He didn't say anything. He just stood at the door, staring at him. The threat was silent and absolute. Javier understood. His war was lost. Don Eladio Montemayor died 2 weeks later. His funeral was the event of the year. The governor attended, the mayor, Commander Torres. Everyone offered their condolences to the exemplary family. Javier watched from afar, and he saw her, Anna. She was standing next to her uncle, the heir. She was no longer dressed in white. She wore a severe black dress, a matriarch's dress. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun. Her face was an expressionless mask, but her eyes were dead. They were 2 empty wells, the pale blue of the Montemayors. Extinguished forever. They had broken her. They had consecrated her. The cycle continued. Javier finished his community service a week later. He left San Isidro del Fuego and never returned. But the town never left him. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he wakes up, and he hears a scream muffled by the sound of a storm. And he sees the face of a girl with dead eyes. And he feels the unbearable weight of a system that, in the face of pure horror, decided that it was best not to get involved. That the customs of the rich are more important than the soul of a girl. And that there are kingdoms that do not fall. They simply change kings and queens. I am Padre del Valle, and the silence that surrounds the Hacienda Las Animas is the most terrifying sound I know.